The first time humans ever got drunk. Imagine finding a piece of fruit that had been sitting in the sun for days. It smells strange. It tastes strange. And yet, after eating it, you suddenly feel different. Nobody invented alcohol in a laboratory. Long before breweries, bottles, wine glasses, or even farming, humans may have encountered alcohol in the wild. So how did the first human discover that rotten fruit could do something very unexpected? The answer begins long before anyone was making beer. Because alcohol isn't something humans invented. Fermentation happens naturally. Yeast eats sugar. And as it does, it produces alcohol. You don't need a brewery. You don't need a recipe. You don't even need a human. Give yeast enough sugar, some water, and enough time, and chemistry does the rest. And that creates a strange possibility. Our ancestors may have been encountering tiny amounts of naturally produced alcohol long before they understood what it was. Picture the world they lived in. There are no farms, no supermarkets, no refrigerators, no sealed containers keeping food fresh for weeks. Fruit grows on trees. Some of it gets eaten immediately. Some falls to the ground. And some sits there, in the heat. Days pass. The fruit becomes softer. Microorganisms move in. Yeast begins breaking down the sugars. The chemistry changes. And eventually, that fruit isn't exactly the same food anymore. It has become fermented. We have no way of knowing whether some prehistoric human actually ate a particular piece of fermented fruit. Nobody was there to write it down. But the environment that makes natural fermentation possible existed long before humans. And humans weren't the only animals taking advantage of it. Researchers have observed wild animals consuming naturally fermented fruits. Birds eat them. Mammals eat them. Primates eat them. Sometimes animals appear to seek out particularly ripe fruit. Which raises an interesting question. If our ancestors were eating fruit in environments where fermentation happened naturally, could alcohol have been part of the human diet long before civilization? Possibly. But here's where the story gets much more interesting. Because humans don't simply tolerate certain fermented foods. We eventually started making them on purpose. And that tells us something. At some point, humans went from accidentally encountering fermentation to deliberately controlling it. That transition changed food forever. But before humans could make alcohol, they had to become extremely good at something much more basic. Keeping food. For most of human history, food was temporary. You killed an animal, you ate it, you found berries, you ate them. You dug up roots, you ate them. There was no freezer waiting back at camp. If you had more food than you could eat immediately, you had a problem. And humans became incredibly creative at solving that problem. They dried food, they smoked it, they salted it, they buried it, they stored it, and eventually they fermented it. Fermentation is basically controlled microbial transformation. Instead of allowing microorganisms to destroy food randomly, humans learned how to create conditions where certain microorganisms could change food in useful ways. And the strange thing is that humans didn't need to understand the science to use it. Nobody needed to know what yeast was. They only needed to notice a pattern. This liquid tastes different after sitting here. Do it again, and eventually, do it on purpose. Some of the oldest evidence for intentionally produced alcoholic beverages comes from ancient societies that lived thousands of years ago. Archaeologists have discovered vessels containing chemical traces consistent with fermented beverages. But these people weren't necessarily the beginning. They were simply the first people who left enough physical evidence behind for us to find. And that's an important distinction. History is full of things that existed long before anyone wrote them down. Wood rots, food disappears, organic liquids evaporate, containers break, entire settlements vanish. So when archaeologists find evidence of ancient alcohol, they're not necessarily finding the first alcohol. They're finding the oldest surviving clues, and those clues tell us something fascinating. Alcohol wasn't just a drink. Fermentation was useful. It could preserve food, it could change flavors, it could make certain foods easier to digest. And, in some cases, fermentation could make water or other liquids safer to consume by creating an environment where some harmful microorganisms struggled to survive. But there was another property. Alcohol changes the brain. Even in relatively small amounts, ethanol affects the nervous system. That means fermented food wasn't simply chemically different. It could produce a noticeable experience. And humans are extremely good at remembering experiences that feel different. Imagine living in a world where almost nothing changes your state of consciousness. You wake up, you hunt, you gather, You make tools, you cook, you talk, you sleep. Then one day you eat something fermented, and something feels different. You feel unusual. Your perception changes. Your coordination changes. Your mood may change. You don't understand why. You just know that whatever you ate was not like ordinary food. That doesn't mean prehistoric humans immediately became obsessed with alcohol. That's a modern assumption we shouldn't make. The archaeological evidence is much more interesting than that. Fermentation appears to have become part of human culture in many different places independently. And that suggests humans repeatedly discovered the same basic trick. Sugar can become alcohol, and humans eventually learned how to control it. But here's the part that makes this story genuinely strange. We may have evolved alongside naturally occurring alcohol for much longer than civilization has existed. Millions of years ago, the ancestors of modern primates were already eating fruit, and fruit is basically a package of sugar. When that fruit falls from a tree and begins to ferment, alcohol can appear naturally. Some researchers have proposed that our primate ancestors may have developed an attraction to ripe, fermenting fruit because it provided useful calories. This idea is sometimes called the drunken monkey hypothesis. But don't take the name too literally. The idea isn't that our ancestors were wandering through forests looking for a prehistoric bar. The hypothesis is much simpler. Fruit that has begun fermenting can still contain calories. And the smell of fermentation may help animals locate ripe fruit. So there may have been an evolutionary advantage to paying attention to those smells. That doesn't mean humans evolved specifically to drink alcohol. It means our ancestors evolved in environments where naturally occurring alcohol was already part of the chemical landscape. And then modern humans took that ancient relationship and completely changed it. Because the natural world gives you a few percent alcohol in a piece of fermenting fruit, humans eventually figured out how to produce much more. And once we learned how, alcohol stopped being an accident. It became technology. That's when things get complicated, because fermentation gave humans something incredibly useful. But humans rarely stop at useful. We optimize, we experiment, we concentrate, we invent. And eventually, people learned that different ingredients produce different fermented beverages. Grains, fruit, honey, roots, palm sap. Almost anything containing enough fermentable sugar could potentially become part of the process. Different cultures developed different techniques. Different climates created different possibilities. And suddenly, fermentation became part of human civilization. It appeared alongside agriculture, trade, feasting, ritual, celebration, and social life. But why? Why would humans spend time making something that wasn't necessary for survival? Because humans don't only eat for calories. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting that ancient alcoholic beverages were associated with feasts and ceremonies. That matters because producing fermented beverages takes effort. You need ingredients. You need containers. You need time. You need knowledge. So if a community is investing resources into making something, it probably serves a purpose beyond simply providing calories. It can bring people together. It can mark an important event. It can be used in rituals. It can become part of hospitality. In other words, alcohol became culture. But there's a darker side to this story. The human brain didn't evolve around unlimited access to concentrated alcohol. For most of human history, naturally occurring alcohol would have been relatively limited and inconsistent. Modern humans can produce it in enormous quantities. That is a completely different environment. The ancient brain and the modern environment are not always a perfect match. And this is a pattern that appears again and again in human evolution. Our ancestors developed systems for a world of scarcity. Then technology removed the scarcity. Food is one example. Sugar is another. Salt is another. And alcohol is another. The ancient world gave us the machinery. Civilization learned how to turn the machinery up. That's why the story of alcohol isn't really the story of humans discovering a drink. It's the story of humans discovering that nature could be manipulated. A fruit falls from a tree. Microorganisms transform it. A human notices, then another human repeats it, then someone improves it, then someone stores it, then someone trades it, then an entire civilization builds traditions around it. That's how technology often begins. The first person to experience alcohol probably didn't understand fermentation. They didn't know about yeast. They didn't know about ethanol. They didn't know what was happening inside their brain. They just encountered something unusual. And that's what makes the beginning of this story impossible to know for certain. There probably wasn't one first drunk human. There was a process, millions of small discoveries, different people, different environments, different fruits. different experiments, until eventually, humans learned the trick. We turned an accident of nature into a technology, and then into a tradition, and then into an industry. A drink that once depended on a piece of fruit sitting in the right conditions can now be engineered with extraordinary precision. The irony is that the basic chemistry hasn't changed. Yeast still eats sugar. Fermentation still produces alcohol. The same microscopic process that could have happened inside a fallen piece of prehistoric fruit can happen inside a modern fermentation tank. The technology changed. The chemistry didn't. And maybe that's the strangest part. Humans like to imagine that civilization separated us from the natural world. But sometimes civilization simply took something nature was already doing and made it much bigger. We didn't invent the natural world. We learned how to manipulate it. And then, we built civilization around those discoveries. So the next time you see an ancient-looking clay vessel in a museum, remember what it represents. Not just an old container. It's evidence of a moment when humans learned that time could transform food, that invisible organisms could change chemistry, and that something found in nature could be repeated deliberately. We don't know the name of the first human who discovered fermented food. We don't know what they looked like. We don't know what they thought when they experienced it. Because before humans learned how to make alcohol, nature had already been making it for us.